Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 44th meeting of the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage. And this morning, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, a full investigation of the role of a public broadcaster in the 21st century. And we welcome our witnesses this morning from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and welcome Mr. Rabinovich, the President, and if you would please introduce your entourage and proceed with your briefing, sir.
Well, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you very much for inviting us. We welcome all efforts to clarify the role of public broadcasting. And with me today on my right is Sylvain Lafrance, the Executive Vice President of French Services. On my left, Richard Stursberg, the Executive Vice President of CBC Television, and Jennifer McGuire, on my far right, the Acting Vice President of CBC Radio. Let me get straight to the point. Canadians could be better served by their broadcasting system and their public broadcaster. Much better. L'environnement de la radiodiffusion.
The broadcasting environment is changing profoundly. We believe that this new context calls for a new contract. The new realities of play require new rules of play. And yet, I'm happy to report to you that the CBC Radio-Canada of today is in remarkably good form. Let's start with traditional media. Our radio services have enjoyed a decade of almost continuous growth in audience share and loyalty. They have enhanced the quality of programming and have won virtually every prestigious broadcasting award, not only in Canada, but around the world. Our French television service has experienced a string of both popular and critical successes over the last 4 years. Everything from Les Bougons through Tout le monde en parle. And people are talking. It is not by accident that Quebecers have ranked Radio-Canada as 4th among the most admired companies, according to a survey published in Commerce magazine in March 2007. Radio-Canada's television is very near to finding that elusive, perfect balance between broad appeal and the exemplary quality of public service programming.
The greatest challenges among all our services is on the move, with a new management team and a bold plan. Faced with ferocious competition, market fragmentation, and changing consumer behavior, CBC Television has maintained a stable primetime share over the last 4 years of between 7 and 9%. That is in the same neighborhood as Global TV and more than double the largest specialty services. This past season, CBC had 15 of the top 20 Canadian shows in terms of audience size. Both Radio-Canada.ca and CBC.ca are among the country's most visited media sites. At a rate of more than 1 million downloads per month, CBC Radio-Canada is one of the leaders in podcasting in Canada. Interestingly, some of our most successful podcasts are our most serious shows, like Les Années-Lumière, Les Premières à la Carte, Ideas, and Quirks and Quarks. And they are being consumed mainly by 18 to 34-year-olds, putting the lie to the belief that you need to dumb down content to reach a younger demographic. The fact is, new technology opens new audiences for existing content. So CBC Radio-Canada is doing well across the board, despite an unpredictable playing field. A few years back, this committee urged us in its report, Our Cultural Sovereignty, to look at how we can better serve Canada's regions. We submitted to the government our first comprehensive plan in the fall of 2004. Having had no take-up on that plan, we recently submitted to government a more modest plan that focuses on bringing local radio programming to the 8 million Canadians living in centres that do not have a local CBC radio service. In the meantime, technological advances are enabling us to rethink our local news offering. Our plan is not to replicate what the private broadcasters already do. We believe that by aggressively managing our budgets and using technology in new ways, we can connect with grassroots communities and at the same time counter the trend in the private sector of a gradual withdrawal from local news. I mentioned our efforts to manage our budgets. You should know that over the last 7 years, we have become much more efficient and focused. We have generated $75 million in ongoing annual cost savings, and last year, more than $93 million in non-advertising revenues through everything from merchandising to the better use of our real estate assets. That in itself is a remarkable accomplishment. Yet we continue to face serious financial pressures. The plain fact is, if these pressures are not addressed seriously and soon, there will be no more rabbits to pull out of a hat. Some still ask the question, is the CBC delivering value for money? And our answer is absolutely. Selon l'étude du groupe Nordicité portant sur un échantillon.
Consider that of the 18 industrialized countries reviewed in the Nordicity study tabled with our submission, our need is the greatest and our system is the most complex. But our funding is the third least, at less than half of the $80 per capita average. The BBC does its job in one language and one time zone with $7.3 billion. In comparison, we do ours with $1 billion in public funding, or about $30 per person, for a service in 2 languages that covers over 5.5 time zones.
The BBC operates under a royal charter that is formally renewed and financed after every decade for the next 10 years. This is the kind of clarity and predictability we seek. Anything less is really paying lip service to the ideal of public broadcasting while watching it wither. But you might ask, what's the rush? Well, in 1997, Canada didn't have 100 digital specialty channels and 100 more foreign satellite channels, or 17 pay-per-view and video-on-demand services. Canadians watch TV and listen to radio not on their laptops, or their Blackberries, or their cell phones, or their iPods. In 2004, there was no satellite radio. In 2005, there was no YouTube. In 2006, no iPhone. Canadians want their programming when and where and how it suits them. CBC's future is that of a content provider that is platform agnostic, not a television company nor a radio network. This is the single reality that is already significantly transforming CBC Radio-Canada. So the extent of change is one reason for urgency. And frankly, the speed of that change makes not reviewing our long-term goals and strategy an unacceptable risk, financially, culturally, and politically. Now, some people will tell you that public broadcasters aren't needed in an age of choice and technology. If ever that was true, it isn't now. There is near unanimity on the importance of the role of Radio-Canada in the role that it plays in enriching the cultural and democratic life of our Francophone community. In French and English, the simple fact is that there are some things that private broadcasters either cannot or will not do, but that only we can and will do, such as Canadian programming in prime time on television, commercial-free, safe, entertaining programming for kids, connections in the north and other remote areas of the country, original current affairs programming, Canadian perspectives on international events, and others that we have listed in our submission. These are the things that others are not in a position to do. And then there's the issue of diversity. In Vancouver today, 2 companies own virtually all the mainstream media on all the platforms. Diversity of viewpoints is disappearing. Canada needs to ensure that those views and voices are heard, and that too is a role for the public broadcaster. So the demand for both quality and diversity of product has skyrocketed, but funding is a real challenge. CBC Radio-Canada has not received a permanent increase in its public funding base in the past 33 years, since 1974. I do want to thank Minister Oda for her announcement yesterday of the $60 million additional funding for programming over the next 2 years, or for the next 2 years. It is essential and it will be well used. More broadly, as you know, the funding model for commercial television is also seriously at risk. So what we need is a long-term, properly resourced strategy for broadcasting for the next decade. We need to engage Parliament and Canadians in a planning process to address the big policy issues. Questions like, does Canada need quality Canadian programming in prime time? Do Canadians want programs that reflect their reality? Television drama is the most pervasive catalyst of popular culture in Western societies. In the last 20 years, every other industrialized country has used its national broadcaster as the anchor in repatriating its prime time schedule. Everywhere else, homegrown drama is the most popular viewing option during prime time. Une autre question qui se pose est de savoir comment.
Another question, how do we expose Canadians to world events through the lens of a uniquely Canadian viewpoint? CBC Radio-Canada already has the most extensive network of foreign bureau of any Canadian broadcaster. But should we do more internationally? Or questions like this, how do we promote social cohesion in one of the most diverse societies in the world? How can we, what is our role in sustaining, a uniquely Canadian identity in an era defined by diversity and fragmentation? How to build a sense of belonging and national pride? Also, how can we engage Canadians in advancing democratic principles? Our television stations are devoted to this, whether it is through Christiane Charette, a cross-country, or the current or cross-country checkup, or Maisonneuve en direct. Our radio is at its best when it hosts the country in conversation.
Broadcasters air little, if any, current affairs and documentary programming. Collectively, 70 hours per year on the English side and less on the French. CBC and Radio-Canada both air literally hundreds of hours per year, and that is not including what we air on CBC Newsworld or RDE. Who else will do that? CBC Radio-Canada is, in fact, a public-private broadcaster in terms of its funding, and a public broadcaster in terms of its mandate. Given our mandate and our funding levels, we must find commercial funding sources to maintain our services. Is that the government's wish? This whole issue should be carefully thought out and planned. We need to strike the right balance. Today, the CBC is at a turning point that no one-year answer will suffice. No one-dimensional response will resolve. What is required for CBC Radio-Canada to reach its potential as an instrument of national policy is a new contract with Canadians. Like all contracts, this would lay out the obligations of all parties and have a specific term of, say, 10 years. Such a contract would provide guidance on the big questions I have raised above. It would be based on the principles already enshrined in the Broadcasting Act and serve as the basis for a clearer contract and mandate with our 32 million shareholders. A fundamental principle that underpins any contract is that sufficient resources be provided to be able to meet the expectations set out in the contract. Frankly, if the money isn't there to fulfill these expectations, the contract will fail. It is our clear hope that this committee will see in the idea of establishing a permanent process to review CBC Radio-Canada's mandate the opportunity for Canadians to renew their relationship with their national broadcaster and to clarify through a contract how Canadians can best be served. Je vous remercie et nous sommes prêts maintenant.
Thank you for your time, and we are now ready to answer your questions.
First question, Mr. Scott.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Rubinovich, and your colleagues for being here today. This is critically important, I think, to the country and overdue. And it will come probably as no surprise that I would sort of support generally the idea that we need to make a new commitment to public broadcasting and to the CBC and Radio-Canada, and that with that commitment would have to come the resources that are necessary to make that commitment be realized in very real terms. You will also not be surprised that I would place certain conditions on that support, and it is substantial support, having to do with the regional and local presence of the CBC. I think it's fair to say that Atlantic Canada has probably been one of the strongest support, television in particular, I think, and it's gone through a bit of a rough period following the decision to move to a half an hour at supper time. And I know in the case of St. John's, the pilot project, to the extent to which it's possible for that to have worked, given the resources were limited, essentially, in this new vision, this new contract, again, that I would very much like to support, elaborate a little bit on how you see this manifesting itself in those parts of Canada that have less access to sort of the national dialogue, less access to other opportunities to find our place in the country. How does that work for you?
Mr. Scott, what I believe we would have to do is have a dialogue with the community at large, and in particular through Parliament, to define what the priorities for the public broadcaster should be. And one of those priorities would be, and has to be, regional extension, explanation, services. We strongly believe that that is important. It's one of the reasons why we have changed once again our 6 o'clock news process and what we are trying to do in terms of developing new services for the regions, which Mr. Stursberg can explain. It's the core of our support in the regions and the services we provide in terms of local radio is what makes, I think, CBC Radio such a powerful force in the country. So we recognize it. We are constrained financially. This is one of the reasons why when your committee put forward a report, we responded quite quickly in terms of what it would take to have a quality, regionally based service above and beyond the services we now run, and how they would all link together. So what we see in a contract is a negotiation. What can you do? What will it cost? What are we willing to do? What are we willing to pay for? And if it was the will of Parliament and the House that significant resources and be assigned to regional and local programming, that is what would be in the contract, and that's what we would be doing.
It occurs to me that it's a bit of a chicken and egg exercise when the resources are necessary to deliver the goods, and some confidence in terms of the content and what's on the other end of the expenditure is sort of a confidence is necessary to support that sort of large investment, because I think it is a large investment that is necessary. I'm personally rather confident in what the outcomes would be with that investment. I've resolved that dilemma in my mind some time ago. But I know that in other areas that's an ongoing question. So I welcome the invitation for the dialogue. And I welcome the recognition that the added dimension has to do with new technology and so on. And I understand the content piece quite easily. As the country explores this, and I do think that as a country, probably maybe even are unique in the world because of our proximity with the United States and also the small population in a large physical space, in terms of what the challenges this represents. But I would flip it and say it also represents a significant opportunity, because my sense is we probably have to do this first because of the nature of Canada, and that allows us then to be first, which has with it lots of advantages. What's the role of the public broadcaster in your mind in that mission for our country? Is it yours to do? Is it ours to do? Is it ours to do together? How do you see Canada pursuing that, and what's your role in it?
My feeling very clearly is that it's ours to do together. There is a role for the private sector, there's a role for the public broadcaster, and very much there is a role for Parliament, committees such as this, to define the priorities and that we should be going to. And as I mentioned in my talk, and perhaps Richard can go into some detail about what we are doing now in terms of regional, because I think there's reason for confidence that we can do this very well. There's reason for confidence that we've done it extremely well on the radio side. And one of our frustrations, as you know, is that there are 8 million Canadians who don't have a local radio service. And we believe it's really important that they have that, both for the future of public broadcasting, because it means there's 8 million Canadians who are underserved in terms of an important local service. But I think that what we would recommend is a process of dialogue between the people's representatives, you, and the public broadcaster and the government as to how much they are willing to finance to help determine the priorities and even have a schedule of implementation, and then we would move ahead to do it.
What are the am I done?
Yes. You'll have another opportunity.
We'll have some time. Yeah, thanks.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Coteau.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour.
Welcome. I heard you, Mr. Rabinovich, say that CBC Radio-Canada is in fine form. Could we understand by that, to better understand and to inform our study, could we understand by that everything is fine in terms of your funding levels? It's an excellent form according to what criteria? Well, I will begin to answer that and say quite frankly that we are in good form. We are in excellent form based on the resources that we have. So there are no doubt other things that we could better do or would like to do, for example, increasing regional programming in English and in French, and take more risks with new programs, both in English and in French. But with the resources that we currently have, I have frankly said that it's not enough. We were very happy to receive those $60 million over the next 2 years, because that will help us with our programming. It's primarily for programming, but as you know, it takes time to develop programs. So we're very happy with that amount of money, but I have to say, quite honestly, that we are underfinanced for the other things that we wish to do. Well, perhaps I could give you an example. In terms of our ratings for French and radio and television and the use of our new media services, things are going very well. There's no problem on that front. However, we are aware of two things. Because of the lack of new funding over the last few years, the gap between people's expectations and the services we can provide is ever growing. And so when we're working in the world of culture, it's like working in a china shop. Everyone is fragile. The people in the gas bay are fragile. People in theater are fragile. The same thing for people in the world of science. So as soon as we touch or affect one of those functions, we affect everyone. And that spread, as I say, between what Canadians want from the corporation and what we can deliver is growing. So another thing, particularly in television, there is an economic model that is in difficulty, particularly for the mainstream broadcasters like ourselves. It's more and more difficult to fund series, and we've seen it on our own network, and it's more and more difficult to launch a new series. So we have a programming schedule, and I can tell you that ours currently has a great deal of public affairs and information programming of a very high quality, but it's becoming more and more difficult to sustain that with our funding. Now, all this could bring about a decrease in the quality of the television we produce, and also creates difficulty for us to be present in certain sectors for very good reasons. And people feel that we are absolutely essential, as it was said earlier, for people in minority language communities outside of Quebec, and just as an example. So it's very, very difficult, and the long-term model is one that is threatened. You also mentioned earlier that you have $75 million in ongoing annual cost savings. So can you give us an idea of what that has meant to the corporation? You're talking about the $75 million generated? Oh, well, I thought you had found a way to reduce your budget by $75 million per year. Well, I think what I said, that through this ongoing annual cost savings, we were able to generate this $75 million. For example, we're now receiving rent from certain tenants we have in the broadcasting center. That represents at least $5 million. We made other arrangements through a neighboring tenant that brings in another $5 million per year. Our Galaxy service is improving and is now bringing in $12 million per year. That's the music service. So all of that is money that we can use to protect our programming. All of that is money that from year to year helps us because inflation is going up, municipal taxes are increasing, and so with those monies we can protect programming. I can say also that it refers to economies we've made in terms of assets to keep the most money possible for programming, so it's not an addition. Another example that's much broader is that we made an arrangement in Vancouver with a developer. We sold the air rights and the parking for $40 million to this developer, and with those funds we've been able to rebuild and digitize the production center in Vancouver. So it's through better management of our assets. Well, we're talking about a lot of money. Oh, I'm sorry.
Mr. Angus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I'm very glad that we are speaking with you today. I think we are on the beginning of a very interesting journey in terms of where we can go with a public broadcaster. I have a few housekeeping questions I guess I need to ask at the beginning. It's been about 6 months now since Mr. Fournier resigned, give or take some time. So you're still now the chair, the CEO, the president. Have there been any steps taken?
I'm the chief poobah, yeah.
The chief poobah in all respects. So what steps have been taken to address this imbalance in governance?
This is beyond my mandate, sir. This is an issue for the government. These appointments are made by the government, and we await their decision as to when and who and how they wish to proceed.
Has there been any discussion between you and the minister in terms of finding a replacement and taking steps?
It's not normal that they would discuss this with me. There are times when they may ask me, what do I think of X or Y, but they have not, nor is it the normal process for them to ask me to suggest names and discuss people with them.
Okay. So the decision to axe the design team in Toronto was made basically on the beginning of when we announced that we were going to undertake this review. Was that a desire on the part of CBC to get facts on the ground before we had come forward with recommendations?
No, actually it predates your decision by almost a year. What happened is, for those of you not so familiar with the ins and outs of this, CBC television had for many years a department which, designed sets and built sets within the organization. And we had a look at this. I must say we're the only English language broadcaster in North America that maintains this kind of capacity. And we had a look at it to see whether there was some way of doing it more efficiently. And we concluded that we could save about $1 million a year by essentially saying to people, if you need somebody to build your sets, go out and get competitive bids from the private market. So that's what we did. We decided simply to get out of the business. The union approached us at that point and said, look, would you mind delaying your decision for a little while we have a chance to explore the possibility of setting up whatever, a company, some form of workers' co-op, so that when people actually leave the building, when the people who are involved in these activities leave the building, they could set themselves up as a little business and then come and bid on the work, whether our work or other broadcasters' work, and maintain their jobs. So we said, sure, that sounds okay. Let's give you some time to see whether you can do that. And so we said we would delay the cuts until the end of the television season, which is really May. And so we gave them about 9 months, and it turned out, unfortunately, that they couldn't find some way through it. And so now all that's happening is we've just simply reiterated the fact that we're going to exit the business. But this all completely predates, as I say, your decision to have a look at the mandate of the CBC.
Where are you in terms of being ready for the high-def market? I mean, the U.S. are talking 2009. Does CBC have a plan? Does it have the resources to be ready to move into high-def?
We don't have the resources to move that quickly. It would take us about, I would believe, if I recall my last numbers, about 10 years to be able to move as far as we think is appropriate at the present time. There are certain places where we have moved very quickly. For example, on the French television production side, we have moved very well, but not on the news side of French television. But on the TV production side, we have digitalized several studios, and we have created HD studios that can move ahead. We have built and we have commissioned and built 2 mobiles, which are HD mobiles. And which are highly useful both for production purposes and for sports purposes. But where we are very short on money is, number one, to finish converting the facilities we'd like to convert at the Toronto Broadcasting Centre. We have no money to convert regional production centres to HD or digital. Except sometimes we get fortunate and we take equipment from one place and move it to another as we upgrade. For example, in Moncton, we were able to upgrade to digital by moving one of the studios to HD. But generally speaking, we are very, very short on that, and we have almost no money at this point for transmission purposes. We count on transmission on satellite, some over the air, but very, very minimally. For that purpose, we would need a significant injection of funds.
So I guess just to follow up to that, the BBC have put their catalog on YouTube of shows. Is CBC in the capacity to put your back catalog onto an internet platform? Have you looked at the cost, what that would take? And have you figured out how you would remunerate the residuals that you'd have to pay for such programming?
The answer is no. We haven't put the back catalog onto the website or onto YouTube. We confront a couple of different issues with respect to the back catalog, by which I take it what you mean is, in large measure, all the old drama shows, variety shows, and so on. First of all, to put it up, you'd have to digitize the whole lot. But secondly, we find ourselves in a peculiar circumstance where clearing the rights associated with these old programs, if we want to put them on the air, is actually more expensive than if we sell them to third parties. So, for example, if the CBC says, you know, I'd like to pull out whatever from the back catalog, whatever the White Oaks of John or the Old Wayne Schuster shows, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and put them on right now, that would cost us more money in terms of clearing the rights than it would for us to sell the program to any other broadcaster. This is an artifact of the way in which the rights agreements work with ACTRA. So I think that's unfortunate, but it just means we face a double problem when it comes to doing that. One, the cost of digitizing, and second, the cost of the rights clearances associated with it.
Can I add one more, if I may add one more thing for completeness? The Department of Heritage has given us, I think for the last 4 years, $2 million a year to digitalize our backlog of programs. And that is what we have done that and are continuing to do it. And from that point of view, bit by bit, we are moving in that process. But it's very much because of a special program run by the Department of Heritage.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Workington.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your testimony this morning. We appreciate you coming and sharing with us and starting with us down this road of reviewing the mandate of CBC as it currently stands and how we might adjust that going forward, at least what we might suggest, where we might suggest changes going forward. Obviously, CBC plays an important role in protecting our cultural sovereignty. I think all Canadians recognize that as Canadians, we have something special to preserve here in Canada, and we want to maintain that, and CBC plays an important role in that, so thank you for that. We do thank you for maintaining fiscal responsibility in the last number of years as you've maintained not only your entity but also the cultural sovereignty as well. Going forward, you pointed out in your testimony, and I think that it would be a surprise to nobody in the country, that as we move forward, we're facing all kinds of obstacles in terms of new technology, folks being able to go other places for their media. Of course, there's hundreds and hundreds of new channels that are coming on stream in any given year. I'll just tell the story. I'm a huge fan of CBC Radio. That's the only talk radio in our area, and so most people that listen to talk radio listen to CBC Radio. Over the last number of years, I've kind of got this informal group of friends that I always know if I want to talk about CBC Radio, something I've heard, I can target them and say, hey, did you hear the story? Did you hear the whatever, something on As It Happens or whatnot? And I found in the last number of years, as I've approached those same friends, they've said, oh, I just got a new satellite radio program, and I'm listening to something else. And I've seen that increasingly in the last year, and I'm kind of surprised by it. But the unfortunate part of this is that people that are listening to other talk radio aren't necessarily listening to anything Canadian, and that concerns me on a couple of levels. One, it concerns me about the future of CBC. Second of all, it concerns me about the cultural sovereignty that we have in this country. And so, of course, we have to address that. And I've asked people, and it's just informal, and I hope that as we move forward in this mandate review, we can come to some understanding and some way to drive people back to things that are Canadian, drive people back to the resources that we have through the CBC. But I'm really concerned about how we do that. Obviously, it seems to be that when I talk to people, they go to CBC for niche products. They go for Hockey Night in Canada. They go for regional news. They go for whatever. And as we see competitors taking up those things, I'm concerned that we're not going to have that niche product. But there are places where I think CBC can identify niche products that they can provide for Canadians that nobody else is going to provide. Obviously, you've identified some. You've identified possibly drama, primetime drama being one of them. To be honest, I'm not sure that that's going to be a wholesale conversion of particularly young people. I'm not sure that that's going to draw them. I talk to young people; they're more interested in reality TV shows. It's not something that I subscribe to necessarily, but it's something that they want to see a little bit more of. And maybe we can have some Canadian content and something down the road. But what are the niche programs or the niche products that specifically? I guess I'm looking at English, the English side, because I know that the French side has some of those more niche products, but specifically when we have the huge competition from our southern neighbors on the English side, what are the niche areas, and are you going to maintain? I know, of course, Hockey Night in Canada has become something of an uncertainty. Where are we with that, and then moving forward with some of the other niche products?
Well, firstly, thank you for the question, because it is so broad that if you don't mind, I'll give a very short answer and then ask Jennifer, who's responsible for radio, and Richard, because you've hit on a few points which are extremely important. Firstly, I don't see new technology as an obstacle. I see it as an opportunity. And I think if you look at the number of downloads we're getting and the age of the people who are downloading, when we do 1 million downloads a month, it's of programs like Ideas. You know, these are programs, I can't convince my son to watch it at 9 o'clock at night. But if he wants to listen to it, or, I'm sorry, not watch it, listen, but if he wants to listen to it while he's on a treadmill, that's just fine. So technology is changing the whole game. And that's why I said as well, we are more and more a program creator than we are a broadcasting network for radio or a broadcasting network for TV. And that's part of what the changes are going to have to occur as we move forward. We must supply the content to Canadians when they want to listen or watch it. And I think some of our new programs, such as The Current, are doing exactly what you described, and they're attracting a large audience, an important audience. Now, let me just add one more thing, and then I'll throw it over. The worst thing that could happen to this country would be if we were the sole supplier of information and news. We don't want a monopoly. I would be devastated as a citizen. And people should be able to get their news and information from NPR, from CBC, from RDI, from CNN. So a monopoly would be the worst thing. But what there must be is a Canadian alternative with a Canadian interpretation. And so that's the balance that I look for. And when you tell me that they're listening to satellite radio, well, that's fine, as long as they also come and listen to us.
The other thing I would add is certainly at CBC Radio, we're actually finding technology is bringing us to new audiences. So when we're conceiving of program ideas now, we think about how it will play across platforms. I'll give you an example. We've gotten into the podcasting game quite heavily at CBC Radio, and for programs like Ideas, which has a strong but skewed slightly older audience on terrestrial radio, it's one of the top 5 podcasts on iTunes, and the demographic of the podcast is younger, and we're finding that now, the same way with our music programming and just approaching it in a broader way. We believe the quality of the content and the distinctiveness of the content is an asset.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate, but I specifically want to two things. As we look at a mandate review, I guess you're saying let's look at more of the production side. Great. Second of all, as we look at the mandate, I'd wonder how you might suggest. We suggest back to you how we drive Canadians to CBC, because I think it's great to have these things available. But I'll tell you that especially there's a certain segment of the population that has no idea that they're available. We need to make that happen. Now
we have to shorten up. Really and truly, we've gone over time here. If you want a response, we have to. Okay,
I'll finish up by this, just saying that, and then I was specifically the niche side, and I don't mind if you reply to us in writing on those two fronts or fill us in. I know that I don't want to take up more time than I allotted. Thank you.
Do we want a response to that?
A very short, if you can.
Well, it's because I think that this is something so fundamental that the question of what's been going on over the course of the last number of years in terms of attracting Canadians, English Canadians to English Canadian programs, I think reflects a very interesting structural problem within the industry. Over the last 15 years, literally hundreds of new specialty services have been licensed in Canada and are authorized for distribution in Canada. We've put in place very significant financing, whether through the Canadian Television Fund. The overwhelming bulk of this effort has gone towards strengthening the private broadcasting industry. As the President said, during the course of that last 15 years, there have been essentially no new channels of any consequence for the CBC, and its financing has not been increased and, in fact, is down almost $400 million in today's dollars from what it was. The result of all that is interesting, which is that if you compare where we are now to where we were even 5 years ago, overall viewing to Canadian programming on English television accounted for 31% of the whole day in 04-05 and 22% during prime time. And this was compared respectively to 34% and 26% 5 years previously. And in fact, what's been going on is we have been slowly losing ground. We've made essentially no progress whatsoever over the course of the last 25 years in terms of the most important categories of programming. When I came to the CBC, I came because like you, I believed absolutely, passionately and deeply that the most important thing was for us to be able to make programs in the most important medium that there is that would connect and resonate with English Canadians. Not only is it not happening at a large enough scale, we're actually losing ground. And I think in part the reason we're losing ground is because the CBC itself has been essentially set to one side for a long, long period of time while we've increased the number of licenses to the private broadcasters, and the bulk of the new financing has also gone to them.
Thank you. Ms. Keeper?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank Mr. Rabinovich and all of you for presenting here today. It is very exciting that we're embarking on this study. I'm very pleased. As has been mentioned, numerous times, and we sort of hear it endlessly at this table, is that it is a new day and there's challenges, as you've talked about. And one of the things I always think of as myself as a middle-aged person, that I hardly seem able to, understand or the new technologies. I hardly seem able to just as an individual sort of keep up. So in terms of the industry and in terms of CBC, the challenges are enormous, and for us as a country to be able to sort of move through this time. And I wanted to kind of ask you about that, the shift, from what traditionally has been CBC's mandate, in terms of services, because you talked about Mr. LaFrance, you talked about the gap sort of between the services you have to provide and the financial constraints. And could you talk about, I guess, maybe how is it that you see the mandate maybe shifting in this sort of new era?
Sure. There is a very real danger of focusing on the transmission of the programs, whether it's an iPod, radio, YouTube, and forgetting about the content. And it's at the end of the day, it's the content that counts. It's the programming that counts. It's a necessary condition that we make the content available in the ways in which Canadians want to receive that content. And the beauty of the new technologies is we're discovering new audiences that people said to us, oh, you'll never get those people below 50. But they're coming, and they're coming to interesting programs. They can go somewhere else for their rock music. They're coming to us for their new music. They're coming to us for bands that have yet to be discovered. They're coming to us for programs like Ideas, which are very thoughtful, discussion, tough programs. And the new technologies allow us to do that. And that's why we must be in the new technologies, because we can't predict, nobody can predict how people are going to get programming in the future. But we can never lose sight of the fact that our first objective is program production. And it is program production that is becoming more and more expensive. And we're not even treading water. We're losing ground regularly in our ability to do the quality programming, take the risks necessary, have the failures, also have the great successes. You know, with this past week we had a wonderful success with the Canada IQ program. It had over 1.5 million viewers. You know, Tout le monde en parle, Les Bougons, these all draw over 1.5 million viewers. And nobody would take on a program like Les Bougons other than the CB Radio-Canada when it was offered. It's a risky program. And at the time we were all a bit nervous. Little Mosque on the Prairie, you know, it could have gone the other way. The fact is, it's now seen as a very successful program. But let's not lose sight of, at the end of the day, it is programming, and it's the funding for programming. We can talk about transmission systems. I'd love to talk about them. I think they're fascinating. But we also can make the big mistake of focusing in that area only.
Maybe I should ask about the same thing, but I think when you look at the fundamental issue, and I know that on peut perdre le sommeil with all of those technology issues because it is very complicated to follow. But I think that fundamentally it's not a technological issue because we know how to deal with technology when we have a technology. The fundamental debate here is about democracy and culture in Canada. Can we save cultural sovereignty in this whole new world? And how our citizens will be able to vote and to understand democracy in this country. So they need to have the tool, they will receive information on a sea of millions of internet websites or stuff like that who are sometimes totally unreliable. So they will have to find some place who are reliable, and I hope that the CBC will be this place, and some of the big players in Canada will be those places where you can find information reliable about democracy, about our culture, about our sovereignty. And I think this is the main issue we have to understand and we have to prepare.
Can you explain a bit more about what the in terms of being content provider and obviously that is, as you're saying, in terms of cultural identity, cultural sovereignty, that's the key. What has been the impact in, say, the last 10, 15 years in terms of your ability to develop those and produce that?
Well, it is fair to say that as our funds have contracted, our ability to develop new programs has contracted accordingly. At the same time, trying to be good, efficient managers, we have tried different techniques and ways to save money so that we can do more programming. One of the areas which I'm most proud of is $10 million from the $60 million we have just received, again, will go into what we call cross-cultural programming. And that is programming between French and English, between radio and TV. By being able to develop the program from first principles to be seen or to be heard on multiple services, you have to start right at the beginning as you're planning the program. The best example is not ours. It's the best example, I think, is Bon Cop, Bad Cop, which, when you talk to the producer, they shot it, they developed it with the idea that it would be for both markets. It wasn't done for one market and then translated into the next market. And the show works because they did that.
Right.
So we are learning in the process, and some of our things are failing. There's no question about it when we try to take from one area and move it into another area. But that's what I mean by taking risk. If you don't take risk, you will not succeed.
Okay, thank you for that. Mr. Coteau.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We were talking about the underfinancing earlier. CBC's mandate is more and more broad, and on the other hand, its funding has been going down. So can you give me an idea about the precise budget of CBC Radio-Canada? I think it's in the book, in the submission that we gave you, very specifically. Well, I'm asking you the question on an exchange basis. Well, I can give you the information service by service. No, but the overall budget of CBC Radio-Canada. Well, overall, currently, with the money that we get from the commercial sector is 1.6 billion. And the parliamentary appropriation is, let's say, 930 million, more or less. I can't give you the specific number here, but about 930 million. Well, could we get a clear idea of how those funds are spent at CBC on the one hand and Radio-Canada on the other? Well, English TV is 500 million and 10. Radio is 1.8 million. Television is 354 million. And French radio is 100 million. I think it's, yes, that's more or less it. In the interest of transparency for us, could we get that information as to the use of that budget? To support the theory that CBC Radio-Canada is underfinanced. In other words, is it possible to have access to your books to support that, as I say? Could you send us that information at some point? Yes, we can send you the detailed information, and also, yeah, it would be of use to our analysts. Also, yes, if the other members wish, we could make individual presentations to explain in detail all of those figures. I still have time? Thank you. I had a question that comes from the funding issue again. From your perspective, should the English television, should it be have to depend on commercial funding to survive today? Well, if it has to survive in the commercial sector, it's just a reality. It is impossible for us to survive currently without it. We have to say as well that almost all public broadcasters in the world, we always think about the BBC, but if we leave that aside, almost all of the other public broadcasters are have a mixed way of working. So like us, they have money from the government, but they also have ads. So it really, we have to ask ourselves a question here. What is our reality? So our reality is that we're underfunded. And that's not the case for radio. That's completely commercial, ad-free. But Mr. Stursberg's situation is very different. It's 40% on the French side. Yes, just to add a word to that, if I could. 55% of our revenues come from the commercial sector, and that really points to the problem. Without that 55%, because CBC and Newsworld have a $600 million budget together, so you can see that if it's 55% of that budget that comes from ad revenues, without that we would have no service. Also, I would like to say that these are not our choices, really. We have 10 times more public affairs show on the French TV than our competitors. We have religious shows. We have shows that are not rating getters for us that bring in ad revenues. Our schedule is very different. This year we had 12 new dramas series, and we are the biggest generator of drama series in the Francophone service, so in the Francophone world of Canada. So we have to make certain economical choices, it's true, but we want to have television that is distinctive by the quality of our shows, the quantity of the drama series we present, and the variety that we produce. Our television is very different from any other Francophone broadcaster service.
Chair, Mr. Rabinovich, you made a bold statement, and I think there's certainly a significant element of truth in it, and I'd like to quote it. The role of public broadcasters has always been to reinforce coherence and common values, end quote. Now, the CBC, of all of our national broadcasters, is considered to be the mirror in which Canadians see themselves. And I think you'll agree with me that there are a significant number of Canadians who, justifiably or not, feel that the CBC doesn't necessarily reflect either their values or, probably more correctly, their perspectives. And in an increasingly diverse society, we're going to have an increasing number of those perspectives. How do we draw these individuals back into the fold where they feel that they're valued, that their views are being recognized as being legitimate, perhaps not shared by the majority of Canadians, but still views that are worthy of consideration? How do we, in such a rapidly changing technological world, bring these people to a point where they do recognize CBC as being their public broadcaster? And perhaps you could also comment on what strategies you've employed in the past to ensure that we have a broad dialogue on these issues, and perhaps new strategies you'll employ in the future to do that.
I'm going to start an answer, but I'm also going to ask Mr. Stursberg, because of, well, it's beyond experiment, which we're now beginning to implement, what we call My CBC, which is in many ways at the local and regional level designed to meet exactly what you're talking about. But let me start by saying we don't define, and it would be a terrible thing if we did, what the common values are. It's our job to make sure that they're reflected and that people have an opportunity to see those values and speak to their values and to the decisions that flow from them.
Those values.
I'm sorry, I can't hear that.
Who determines those values? If you don't, who does?
No, we when we're talking about the news service, it's determined within the news service, but we also watch very carefully to make sure that there is balance in the programming. We also have a very sophisticated, the best in the world, that has been recognized as that, ombudsman system, in order to check on us, to make sure that we are doing the job correctly. And we take extremely seriously the concerns when voiced to us, and they are regularly voiced, because often it's not balance that people want. It is an expression of their opinion or their side that they want. And we get this all the time in international affairs in particular, where one side or the other or both sides of an issue are very concerned about how we have presented the issue. It's our job to try and be balanced and fair, and we have determined with the Ombudsman's guidance certain procedures. So sometimes a show may seem to be overbalanced in one direction. There must be a show very soon after which is balanced more in the other direction. So we have set up rules so that we're not just doing boring television in the name of balance, but we're doing fair television, and fair means representing all sides, or allowing all sides a chance to be represented. But again, the key is an ombudsman system to hold us to account and as a check. But I think even more important is the work we're now trying to do using all of our media interrelated.
I'll just say one thing. Obviously, what the President said is right. It's not our job to tell Canadians what the values are that they should espouse. What our job is to reflect the full diversity of view within the country. One of the things that it comes up when we were talking about regional before, I really kind of, when we think about regional, what I try to think about it is in a different way. It's not just that if we do a newscast, we see Calgary or we see Halifax. It's rather that what you want reflected on the national news is the perspective of Calgary or the perspective of Halifax, so that the full diversity of voice of the country, whether it's a regional diversity of voice or a political diversity of voice or a social diversity of voice, is fully reflected on the network. One of the things that we're trying to do is, and that implies, I think, actually a decentralization of the way in which we've approached these kinds of questions in the past. That's why we put a new emphasis on rebuilding our local and regional presence, but doing so in a way that allows Canadians to participate more effectively in commenting on the news as we provide it, and indeed in helping us determine what the priorities for news coverage should be. So what we've done is this concept that the President was referring to called MyCBC, which we're trialing out right now in Vancouver. We've said to ourselves, let's take the totality of our assets, radio, television, online, and let's put them together to create an integrated news service that works in a way that Canadians can get their news whenever and however they want it. But equally importantly, let's use the power of the new technologies to allow Canadians to participate much more profoundly in the conversation about what constitutes the news. And this goes by different kinds of names. Some people call it citizen journalism, but what it means is we use the website to allow people not just to comment on what comes through the news, not just to engage in dialogue with our own journalists as to what they see and the extent to which they think it's accurate or fair, but beyond that to allow them to tell us, this is the things that you're not covering that we think are important to us, and beyond that to say to people, you know what, we would welcome your contributions to the news service itself so that we create opportunities for them to be able to upload what they think, whether that's in the form of video, whether that's in the form of voice. So what we would like to do is we would like to, if I can use this expression, you know, in the past people sort of think of the news as being something that people say, we, the news, tell you what's the news. And we think that's completely old school. We don't want to have, what we want to do is we want to flatten it completely so that what the news becomes is essentially a dialogue between citizens as to what it is that matters and how it is that they see things, and we become, in some sense, the mediator of that dialogue.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Fry.
Thank you very much. I want to apologize for being late. I think I waited 3/4 of an hour for a taxi this morning, at least where I live. But what I wanted to ask you, I mean, we've heard over and over from most people. I've tried to ask a clear question. What would you think if there was no more CBC? And what we've heard from every sector is that the CBC is extraordinarily important to Canadians. Their concerns, however, is that you are not getting to them anymore. And of course that has to do with the new digital mode and having not have the infrastructure to get there. In many instances you've had to cancel where you're going because people have to tag on to cable television to get there. So we've heard over and over that people think that you're doing a good job with what you have, but that you must move into the regions in a different way, that you must reflect Canadians back to themselves, especially regionally, to the nation as well as the nation to the regions, and that the regions to the nations aren't doing as well as they could. So people have all said one important thing: the CBC must be funded appropriately, and we've seen the reports, the North City study, etc., that have basically said that we're way down the ladder. So given that Canadians support a public broadcaster, given that people say that you need to have more money, do you see the CBC working well and differently if it were given better funding to actually work in the way that the BBC has done? In other words, to change your system of reporting, your direct responsibility to Parliament, a specific trust that would look after much of how you function, so that you can be far more accountable with the money you have and go to Parliament, not necessarily, to anyone else, so you can get the feedback from Parliament. So every year you would be able to table what you're doing. People also thought you needed to focus more And I think many feature film people said that you, CBC, could be the distributor in the digital medium for Canadian feature films, for Canadian documentaries, and for Canadian performing arts, which, as you know, has been cancelled and was a well-watched section of what the CBC used to do. So I want to know what your comments are on some of those things.
Well, you've covered a lot of territory.
Sorry, Robert.
No,
Sorry,
that's fine. I'll try and comment on some, and perhaps my colleagues will add in as well. What I find comforting, if I can use that word, from what I understand of your hearing so far, is a growing recognition that you just can't say to the CBC, do more. I think there's a growing recognition that we are stretched as far as we can be stretched, and if we were to do more, in fact, we'd do less. Something would have to drop off off our schedules and off our approach. And I haven't heard much in terms of people saying we should get out of this or that, which is in a reasonable way, because whenever I hear it, I don't see them telling me how I'm going to get the money that the X or Y generates for us to be able to continue to do what we're doing. So that I find very, very reassuring. As I said in my introductory comments and in the paper that we have tabled with you, I believe we are at a crossroads. We have done ad hoc hearings about the CBC every 3 or 4 or 5 years. I believe it is time, and we believe it is time, to structure that into a contract. And that contract, like all contracts, will have clauses and expectations. This is what we expect. We would say this is what it costs, and there would have to be an agreement on both. Or if we think it's going to cost X, but you can only give us half X, well then there'll be an agreement that we will bring it in at a particular speed. But I fully accept and think it is eminently logical for the government and Parliament to define more precisely what it wants from its public broadcaster and in a contract, and then you go forward with that. I dare say the BBC is exactly the same thing, and if you look at the contract, it has changed with time. The current contract puts much more stress on light entertainment. And one of the phrases they use is a public broadcaster need not be boring. The BBC contract also calls for them to decentralize certain operations. The contract also calls for them to buy more from the independent sector and produce less in-house. But this is fine. This is part of defining where you want us to go. So my answer to you is, this is the debate and the dialogue we must engage in. And it's not something that can be done overnight. It's something that I think we would have to work on together and involve the Canadian public. But also, the core is also, and I must say it, the core for us is the programming. The core for us is getting the programming out to people, i.e. the new technologies and transmission systems. But without the programming, without the funding, we have nothing to put in the transmission systems. What's the purpose of a pipe if it's empty?
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Abbott.
One of the more interesting groups that comes together to comment on broadcasting in Canada is Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. I wonder if you could describe to us what, if any, relationship there is with the CBC. What you think of that organization? Like, they are pretty aggressive in the way that they have their perspective, and that's fine. This is a democracy, but it does seem to key an awful lot on the CBC, and seems to be very strongly in support of the CBC. I just think it would be interesting for us to get your perspective on that organization.
We see the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting as a lobby organization for broadcasting in general, and in particular Canadian broadcasting, with some focus on the CBC. We sometimes believe that the focus is very narrowly defined around the regions and around local programming. We don't disagree with it at all. We think that it makes eminent sense, but we do believe that it can be irresponsible to call for us to do more of X without telling us either what are we to drop or how is it going to be financed. And I believe that they feel it is their responsibility to highlight issues rather than to tell the parliamentarians and the CBC how to finance those issues.
I just would add one thing. I think there are certain areas in which we actually depart company from the Friends. The Friends, as I understand it, came here and said the other day that they didn't think we should be in the Internet and that, you know, our website was not particularly effective. I've forgotten what their number was. I think they said we were getting 2,000 views a day or something. But the fact of the matter is that, you know, our Internet site gets 3.6 million unique viewers a month. And it is without any question, far and away the most important news and information website in the country in terms of its usage and in terms of the depth of its content. So we think, for all the reasons we were talking about earlier on, that one of the fundamental responsibilities of the public broadcaster is to be able to serve Canadians by whatever means and by whatever manner they find most convenient. And if they want to get their news online, we should be there for them online. If they want to get their news off mobile phones, we should be there to make sure they can get their news in whatever way suits their lifestyles and their purposes.
I just think, if I may editorialize for just half a second, I think it's rather fascinating that they seem to reflect where our government is coming from sometimes, not normally, but sometimes. And then we're hearing from you that on the other side of the coin, you feel that some of their commentary isn't necessarily helpful to the CBC. So I guess it really does underscore their independence, doesn't it?
I don't think there's any doubt about their independence.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go over. Oh, who we got? Oh, Mr. Angus.
Oh, sorry.
Mr. Angus.
Thank you very much. One of the interesting elements that we learned for those of us who are on the Heritage Film Study is the shocking fact that we could be expected as Canadian taxpayers or as Canadian independent businessmen to put $3 million into a movie that has no real distribution plan. And so the question is, why would we spend money making Canadian movies if there is no long-term plan? Beyond the original broadcast, but the back-end sales, the DVD sales. If we're going to make this investment, where's the plan? So the question comes to, why would we make Canadian television if we don't have a plan for the residual sales, as you were talking about the multi-platform use? So my question is, given the fact that we don't really have access to our incredible back catalog of CBC resources because of the problems with rights, when you negotiate deals for television productions right now, do you have the ability to put that on the air in any format, and do you have a plan for monetizing it so that that there is a return, whether through online advertising or whatever?
Sure. Maybe I'll start, and in terms of the English markets. Clearly, in terms of where we're going, we completely agree with you that what we need to do is we need to develop all of our content from the very beginning so that it fits with all the potential platforms on which it can be viewed or seen. And that what we want to do is we want to be able to monetize that. So what we inside the CBC have done is we've completely transformed our development process to make sure that from the very moment we think of a project, we think about it in terms of all of the different platforms on which Canadians might want to see it. Obviously, where this becomes a little bit trickier is that when we're dealing with independent producers, the news and whatnot we make ourselves, but when we're dealing with independent producers, it's another issue. I know that the Canadian Film and Television Producers Association came down to see you the other day, and they said that, you know, they thought that we were a bit tough on them in terms of wanting to get these kinds of rights for other platforms over and above television. What we actually had proposed to the Producers Association originally when we first began discussing this matter was, we said, look, you know, the problem with these new platforms is nobody actually knows what they're worth. We don't know because it's early days. So why don't we do this, to your monetization point? Why don't we enter into an agreement between the CBC and the producer of the program, that for all those other platforms, we will act as your distributor. We'll distribute to, you know, whether it's a video on demand offer, whether it's a mobile offer on a handheld or a cell phone, or whether it's an internet offer for the show. We'll work with you to make sure they get good distribution. And what we'll do is we will split the revenues 50-50, and off we go. And we said, let's do that for a short period of time until we can see how the market settles down and what these platforms are really worth. We thought that was a terrific offer because what's going to drive all of the new platforms is, if you like, the great bullhorn of television, which is the dominant platform and will remain the dominant platform for the time being. But that way we could share the risk associated with going forward, and at the same time we could share the revenues. They declined this proposition. They declined this proposition. And I think, frankly, this is unfortunate because I think what it will do is it will slow our capacity as a country to develop content, Canadian content, for those new platforms.
No, in the French world, we have quite the same problem. En français, cette question-là des droits.
That issue of rights is really fundamental, it's basic, and it's complex because it's international in scope and also affects the Canadian Television Fund, which determines certain rules. So in a sense, they've begun to arbitrate this relationship we have with the Producers Association. So when we buy a new series or a license, we aren't allowed to discuss the other rights. And I don't think that's very intelligent, and it complicates our problem in Quebec. Because, for example, the broadcaster is the launcher of the new series, so that if there's not, if TVA, TVQ are not doing something like that, it will never exist. Whereas we cannot benefit from all of the rights, and we're not allowed to even discuss it at the outset. So what's happening is that these series will no longer exist at some point in time. I think time will sort this out because technologically speaking, we will have no choice but to change those practices. It will have to be the case because the broadcaster is making far too significant investments to be content with just the first or two steps in the broadcasting of it. If we want to protect the content, and this is a great success in Canada, in French Canada especially, we're going to have to make new deals with independent producers.
There's now a long tail for both the monetization and for the viewing. People are not going to necessarily watch things when we tell them to watch it. They're not necessarily going to watch it the way we tell them to watch it. And there has to be an adjustment in the financial model and in the purchase model. And I think that is one of the key issues before the Canadian Television Fund, which has provoked the discussions that we're now having. And that is how to move forward. From the point of view of the independent producers, there's fear that they're going to be taken to the cleaners. And that's why we thought we were being fair in saying, hey, look, we'll act as your distributor, but it'll be a 50-50 deal. Something will have to be worked out because you're absolutely right. Without that, we're going to be depriving a lot of Canadians of Canadian content.
It seems to me in the issue of cultural sovereignty, that's what we've been speaking about, a democratic voice in a cultural space digitally. There's two choices. We can either invest in the digital realm, or we can try and impose laws to insist that people watch a certain percentage. And I think if we looked at Iran or China or Syria or any other country that has attempted this, it doesn't work. We have to get serious about whether or not we're going to take our cultural product and get it out there so people can watch it. So the question that we have to ask is, are you suggesting that there needs to be changes at the Canadian Television Fund so that if we are putting money into television programming, we can be insisting that those programs will be shown on various platforms after the initial viewing?
I think this is one of the major issues that the CRTC task force will have to confront. And we will definitely talk to them, and when we meet with them, we will be talking to them in terms of the long tail to rights and how we come to an accommodation that makes some sense.
Thank you. Just one thing to my people that are asking questions. When you're getting near the end of the 5 or 6 minutes, maybe you could look towards the chairman when I'm trying to get your attention.
Well, Mr. Chair, it's a secret. We never look near the chair when we're getting near the end of the 5 minutes. We just keep going till the hook comes.
I know the trick. I know the trick. Thank you. Mr. Scott.
To that point, Mr. Chair, I was here 7 years before I realized there was a chair.
Oh, thank you.
The 3 questions, or 3 points I'd like to make. First of all, in the context of the CRTC review and your representations to the CRTC, I know I think in 06, in a submission, there was a reference to the fact that in terms of investment, we had to look at sort of forward-looking investments rather than panicking with the declining over-the-air numbers and making choices. I need you to elaborate on that. Is that, where are our priorities here? Because I think it's critically important to understand the relationship between the traditional world that was the world that I sort of engaged television with, and the world that my 1-year-old son is going to walk into. Where do you fit? And you need to elaborate, because a lot of people are scared of that comment, as you can well imagine. Secondly, in terms of the review or the mandate itself, I think there's a great deal here that speaks to the regions, that speaks to our diversity, that speaks to language and so on, the North. Given the nature of the changing, all of the inputs that are available, would it be advisable to deal with a chronological piece of the mandate? In other words, I'm thinking that with all of the offerings that are available, the other elements of this mandate to affect the minds of Canadians, to affect the impression of Canadians of their own country and so on, that's clearly there. But if nobody's accessing it, it's hard to do that. That maybe a mandate has to see you involved in schools, see you involved in a different way so that the people have exposure. You were the only, or I guess there was only 2 television stations. I'm only 52. And there were only 2 television stations most of my sort of formative years. And so this piece worked well then. Now it's very different, and maybe there has to be more creative ways to be there for people, to engage them in the national or in the public broadcaster and so on. I'd be interested in that. And the other one I think is there's a large elephant in the room having to do with funding. As a member of previous governments and so on that took decisions that negatively affected the resources available to the CBC, I think that we must all try to get past it from a political context so that we can actually do the right thing by the public broadcaster. And I appeal to all members to allow that, so we don't get into sort of silly debate about that. I know that may be self-serving, but there are both sides of all debates, and I think it would be a waste of time for us to get too engaged in that, to simply deal with what it is we wish to see from the CBC, what it is that, and how it may wish to reposition itself in some ways to deal with new realities. And I go back to what I said, and I also really would like you to clarify or elaborate on the earlier representation to the CRTC on where the various medium fit.
That's one way to get all your questions in one shot.
Yes, it is. That was my second 7 years.
With respect to the over-the-air, when we just talked to the CRTC, we were very cognizant of the fact that we have 650 transmitting towers for television alone, and plus radio as a separate item. That these towers are aging. They were built mainly in the 1970s, and they were built to serve all communities of 500 or more. And it was a government policy called the Accelerated Coverage Plan. We knew that this is a system which is perhaps designed for a different era, an era when the bulk of people got their television over the air. The fact of the matter is now, basically 90% of Canadians, give or take a couple of percentage points, and who's doing the calculation any one day, 90% of Canadians choose to pay to get their television via satellite or via cable, primarily. And now we're going to, and very shortly we'll have more delivery by the telephone companies. In the process, a very unique thing has happened. The regions that were les régions défavorisées, regions that are underserved in terms of television, and maybe only had one channel, are now the ones that are getting the multitude of channels via Express View or Star Choice. And where people choose still to get their television off air, the bulk of them are in urban communities. And they are in urban communities, and that's a conscious decision on their part or a financial decision. Conscious because maybe they don't watch TV, maybe because getting over-the-air CBC and CTV is more than enough for them because of the amount they watch, maybe just news, but it's generally speaking a conscious decision not to get their television over the air. We had no suggestion from government, nor were we certain it was the correct policy, that all those 650 transmitters be replaced. It's a very expensive undertaking. With 42 transmitters, as we move to the digital era and move to HD, we can cover 80% of the population over the air, and the bulk of the people who have chosen not to take television by cable or satellite. So we were not depriving people by saying this is a rational business model. If the government wants us to go all the way, we're more than willing to do it. If I was asked for advice wearing my old bureaucrat's hat as a policy advisor, I would suggest that perhaps there are better ways to spend the money in broadcasting than to replicate an old system. That the money and get again tied up in transmission rather than in program production. So when we went to the CRTC, we went with what we thought was a responsible way to deliver HD over the air to 80% of the population. I must say, TQS said they were going to build one transmitter for HD, at most. So, in many ways, others are very, very concerned about the cost of that. So that was the essence of our presentation, and it was trying to be reasonable and rational given the economic situation within which we live, and given that our priority is still and will be programming. Which gets me to the second part of your question, and that how do we reach out and educate people about the availability of CBC? Well, in many ways, I think that's exactly what the new technologies allow us to do. You know, I jokingly say that sometimes CBC radio in particular is an acquired taste. If you're under 50, you're not going to acquire it. You acquire it with time. The fact is, I'm wrong. I know it from my own kids and their friends. There's a lot of younger people who like and are attracted to CBC radio, and we're proving it now with iPods and downloads that there are many ways to get to people in English and in French through the new technologies. And I think that's what we have to do. We must be involved in all the new technologies. Some are going to fail, no question. Some are going to be overtaken by other technologies. But we must respond to Canadians and say, hey, you can get that program when you want to see it, not when I tell you to see it. And I think in that way we will continue to build an audience for CBC in the long run. If we're not in those technologies, we will lose them. You know, and if somebody wants to watch an Olympic or result on their small little cell screen, but they want it immediately, we've got to be there. And we were there in the last Olympics, and both the cellular provider and ourselves were ecstatic at the number of new people who actually tuned in just to see the event, and then move on or then see it on a big screen. What you say in terms of funding is the dream that I would have, that we could, with all of you, define what it is you want from the public broadcaster, what are the holes in the system, the Canadian system, and I believe, for example, drama is a tremendous hole. Service to les communautés francophones hors de Québec is an extremely important service that we must do if we believe in how this country is going. But that is something to be defined beyond just the Broadcasting Act and to be defined in a regular manner, I say, every 10 years. And that means that at the 7th year you begin to evaluate us and go forward. But a contract has two parts to it. Part one is what is expected. Part two is how it's going to be paid for. And the two must merge together. And the only way I can see this happening in the long run is for all of us to do it together.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Brown.
Good to see our witnesses back. I was on the committee in the 38th Parliament that reviewed the feature film industry. Pardon me? Yes, I recently just joined the Heritage Committee again. So back then, when we had you in front of the committee, or a few of you anyway, we were talking about how we would go forward, and there was some suggestion at that time that there should be a study of the role of a public broadcaster in the 21st century. So I'm happy that I'm arriving right at this time when this study is underway. But at that time, we used to talk a lot about some of the unique Canadian stories that were undertaken by the CBC, things like the Avro Arrow, the H2O, and some of these other documentaries, these unique Canadian stories. Is there work going on right now for more of those? I have a number of questions, so maybe I'll start with that, so I'll throw that out.
Richard, Sylvain?
Well,
and also radio, there was something radio.
Right. Well, the short answer is yes. I mean, our overwhelming focus is on making television programming that is distinctively Canadian, and that is smart, and that is popular. This year alone, we broadcast a docudrama on the life of René Lévesque. We did a docudrama to some controversy on Tommy Douglas. We did a docudrama on the War Measures Act and the events of October 1970. But we think that there are a whole series of other ways of also exploring the nature of the country. I think certainly the one that I'm most fond of is Little Mosque on the Prairie. And Little Mosque on the Prairie gave us an opportunity to explore relationships between the Muslim community and the community more broadly, but to do so in a way that, in which we put aside stereotypes, in which we put aside, a whole series of sort of vilifications that have been going on over the course of the last little while, and had an opportunity to make a comedy in which people encountered each other in their full differences, but completely as human beings. And the thing that was so fantastic about this particular program was the response of Canadians was overwhelming. Overwhelming. This clearly became not only the most talked about, but the most popular news show, I dare say, in the last 5 years. It was, in fact, it became a sort of small ambassador for the country throughout the rest of the world. It was CNN sent Paula Zahn up to talk about it. It was on the front page of the entertainment section of the New York Times. It was covered extensively in France and in Britain as to what it was. And many people's feeling was, not only was this an interesting thing because it was a sort of uniquely Canadian way of exploring these kinds of issues, but it was something that many other people would have found absolutely impossible to approach. So it's not just to do things that are, docudramas about historical events, but to engage in terms of the kind of current social issues that confront us, and to do so in a way that's popular, that's smart, and that's entertaining.
Okay. Well, we know about the announcement from Minister Oda, so of the $60 million, and we heard a little bit about what you were going to do with $10 million of that money. What might Canadians expect from this increased investment in the public broadcaster?
Well, generally what we have done and will continue to do, because one of the things one must remember is that it takes a couple of years from idea to getting on to this, to the actual creation of the program. But what I have done in the past with the approval of my board is we have given some money to radio, and we have seen in particular radio using it for very creative programming and new programming, so the number of repeats has gone down quite significantly as we try new programs, and also try what we call cross-cultural programs, doing a jazz festival from Montreal in English and in French at the same time. Which was what we did about 2 weeks ago. And basically, that $60 million is all in programming, and it goes to programs of that nature. It makes possible a program like Little Mosque on the Prairie, and it'll make possible for the second season of that program. What we will do is basically we do split the money between the networks, and again, more or less on a 60-40 basis. In order to fund the creation of new programs.
Okay, well maybe we can...
And continue.
Okay, maybe we can blue sky a little bit here. what do you think the optimum level of funding would be on an annual basis? And what could Canadians expect if you got that optimum level of funding?
I'm not going to duck, but I'm not going to give you an answer. Because I think
I've asked you this before.
I think the reality is that it depends on what are the priorities that you as parliamentarians ask us to do. If you want us to expand our regional services, we have tabled a report with the government that says it would take a minimum of about $120 million. If you want us to cover all the 25% of the Canadian population that doesn't get a local radio service, that'll cost about $20 to $25 million. If you want us to accelerate getting into HD, that can cost up to $100 million. My own feeling as well is programming is what it's really all about. And $60 million, remember it's $60 million now for, and I'm not knocking the 60, believe me, but it's $60 million, the same 60 for the last 6 years and for 2 more years, including the coming one. The cost of programming keeps going up. I would bet that it would take a minimum of $150 million devoted solely to programming to solve, or not even to solve, but to give us to be well positioned to do the programming part of our job. So again, it comes down to, sir, what are your priorities? And then let's talk about them.
Okay, thank you. I've looked at the chair and he gave me the axe. So
big mistake.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate that little look over here. That was really nice. I just would like to say before we complete this session to thank our witnesses here today. And it has been requested. I was just wondering if there are any of our members around the table that have any further questions. Not publicly here, but what we would do if they could get them to you, and maybe those responses could come back to the whole committee. So we'll leave that open. I know Mr. Koto had mentioned maybe had a few more questions. So I hope that you will receive those questions and bring them back to this, or to send the response to the committee.
By all means, we would encourage it. Call it transparency, call it what you want. The important thing is that you be informed as fully as possible of how the operation works. And I hope you will get the opportunity to see more of the operation across Canada. And finally, if I may, I hope that we get the opportunity to come back again in one of your last rounds once you have completed hearing from Canadians and discuss ideas together.
Okay, thank you for that. I just have one little, I always kind of wait till the end and give a little statement, and I know it's something that we heard. We were very fortunate, some of us, to get to Yellowknife and to visit CBC North. We were also to Vancouver to visit the CBC studio in Vancouver. And one thing that seems to me and to some of my colleagues as we have talked about, and this goes back even to some of the review of our movie industry, was good quality programming. And sometimes I wonder if sometimes the funds aren't spread too far, that if there are good quality programming, and rather than have 24-hour-a-day or 18-hour-a-day programming, that that time might be squeezed together a little wee bit to make sure that the high-quality programs come out, put it in the can, and it can be watched at various times. I know I went to bed in Vancouver and fell asleep with my television on, and I woke up, I think it was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and Peter Mansbridge was given the news, and I think that's when I fell asleep. So it was either a very long newscast or but I think that is another way to maybe stretch the funds, have that good quality there, and to maybe shorten up some of the how far we're trying to reach, and make sure that quality is there. But that's just my for instance. And again, thank you for coming. What I would like to do is we have a little bit more committee business to do, so we'll just take a break for about 5 minutes so that we can get our rest of our business done. Thank you. Can we please get this meeting back? We've only got 5 minutes. I think we probably have another committee coming in after us, so okay, we do have a motion before us here, and it's a motion put forward, notice of motion on February the 26th, 2007, Dr. Hetty Fry, that the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage require the CRTC Task Force on the Canadian Television Fund to conduct public hearings and only where necessary hold certain meetings in camera. That motion is put forward. If you'd like to speak to the motion, very short, because we've only got 5 minutes.
I just like to speak to the motion. I think the motion is a reasonable one. No one is suggesting that the CRTC is up to no good. But the thing is, when the CRTC publishes a public report but has only in-camera hearings, nobody knows what they heard, who they heard from, whether their reach was broad enough or anything. So we don't know whether they are reflecting in their report what they actually heard. And more, as we go around the country, we recognize that the public are very interested in programming and in broadcast and in how the CRTC is working and in the new digital media. So that I think that it's a good accountability thing for this to happen. And all this does is to say that as Parliament we have the ability to require the CRTC to do so. The Minister doesn't, but Parliament does. And so I'm just suggesting that Parliament just simply says to the CRTC that they hold public hearings and that they can hold in-camera hearings where they think it's in the best interest of protecting their witnesses. They can make that decision themselves.
Okay, very short, Mr. Abbott, and then Mr. Angus.
Notwithstanding the words of my friend, the fact of the matter is that this motion is questioning what the motivation of the CRTC might be, and it also questions their level of competence. It's absolutely outrageous. Totally apart from that, I would like the clerk to be able to tell us, does the Canadian Heritage Committee, the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage, have the authority to make a statement that we require? If it's the desire of the members to suggest, of course we would, the government would vote against that, but that's up to the committee. But the difference here is that I'm asking, in terms of the word require, we don't have the capacity to require the CRTC to do anything, do we?
Well, it is a request that the committee is making of the House. In French, it's saying the Canadian, the Standing Committee asks, and an expression.
Require. Require is, in the English version I'm reading, Canadian Heritage Require. The CRTC is a totally independent commission, totally independent of the Parliament of Canada, and certainly totally independent of this committee. I don't see any way that this motion would, if it's passed by the committee members as written, this motion would make us very laughable.
Mr. Angus? Very short.
Very short. This motion comes from February 26, 2007, when we were discussing the Canadian Television Fund. There was ample opportunity at that time to deal with the various recommendations. This motion did not come forward then. It's coming forward now after a report has been submitted to Parliament. If we accepted this, it would certainly, number one, bring into question the credibility of our Heritage Committee that we're now running across with addendums to reports that have already been brought before Parliament. Secondly, I think it brings into question the credibility of this committee if we've been raised issues about political interference at the CRTC. If some of us have objections to the minister directing things that we don't like, that we're turning around now after we've already submitted our report and telling the CRTC how to do their job. I think that this is too little, too late, and should not be accepted.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Very short.
The honourable member is saying that this just came forward. It did not just come forward. I, in fact, had that motion on the table when I asked the honourable member to look at it on the day he was discussing his motions. May I finish speaking, please, Mr. Chair? Thank you. On the day the honourable member submitted his own motions, which we supported wholeheartedly, I asked him then if he would look at amending his motion to include this. It was already a written motion and was sent out. And he said no. He declined at that time to even consider it. So we asked for it to be considered later on. We were told it would happen. It is only now coming to be discussed here. The point is that we are not the minister. The minister and the department cannot intervene and interfere with CRTC. However, we are Parliament. We are representative of Parliament. We are an all-party committee. Therefore, the CRTC is responsible to Parliament. This is a process motion. This is not an emotion that reflects on the CRTC. It's simply an accountability for a process that is open.
Okay, we've heard the points on the table. I'll call the motion or call the question that the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage require the CRTC Task Force on the Canadian Television Fund to conduct public hearings and only where necessary hold certain meetings in camera. All those in favour? All those against? I vote against. Meeting adjourned.
Conformément à l'article 108.2 du règlement séance d'information sur la phase d'utilisation de guichets automatiques et de paiements électroniques, I welcome our witnesses. I thank you for being here. We will allocate 5 minutes, as you've already been informed, for each presentation. To the witnesses, I will give you an indication when you have 1 minute remaining.
Would you like one?
As such, I will then have to cut you off after your 5 minutes has elapsed, and we will leave time for questions with committee members. Thank you again for taking the time to be with us today. It's much appreciated. A little bit of housekeeping before we commence to the committee members. Following the presentation, we have 1 hour for the ATM presentations, 1 hour for the electronic payments. I will carry on to allow an hour for each panel, so we will go a little long. Next week, we will move to deal with estimates. Following the break week, we will be back and continue our discussion on these topics which we're dealing with today. First of all, from the Canadian Bankers Association, Raymond Prodi, President and Chief Executive Officer, I understand not long for his position, but welcome today, Mr. Prodi. Welcome, and 5 minutes is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have with me Karen Michelle, who's the Vice President of Banking Operations and who knows and understands the ABM system well. You're quite correct, Mr. Chairman. After 39 plus years, this will be my final appearance in front of the Finance Committee. I must say that I've always been received with extreme courtesy by the members of the committee in all the appearances I've had, and I want to thank all of you for that.